Welcome all. My name is Chris West. I'm the owner and operator of Echo Houses of Vermont. I'm a certified passive house. I have a degree in mechanical engineering, which is where I kind of got into the building side of things. And what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about vapor drive, what it is, and how we can use that to ensure that we don't have building failure. It's not to say that there aren't plenty of buildings that you guys have been involved with, either building or designing, that would, in our analysis, possibly fail. This is about making a more robust wall to ensure that they won't fail into the future. There we go. So first of all, I'm not a building scientist, I'm a consultant. All the information I'm going to be presenting here today is stuff that I have gotten from building scientists and other building science experts, such as Peter Yost, Joe Stebrook, John Straub, and others. These are people who are involved with the Building Science Group and Green Building Advisor. At the very end of the presentation, there'll be a list of resources that I cite in the presentation. So I'm going to start out just by talking about what we have to protect our buildings against. If our buildings lived in a greenhouse, none of this would be an issue because we'd be able to keep bulk moisture and things off of our buildings. But we want to do our best to keep our buildings durable, which means no wood rot, no mold, no building degradation due to water. And our sources of moisture that are available to us in this wonderful blue marble that we live on: bulk water from rain, bulk water from the ground, air transported water through infiltration, which is a lot more what I was talking about last time with air sealing, and transported water through water vapor and through vapor drive. We all know about bulk water. We know we've got to keep water out of our buildings. We flash our windows, we damp proof our foundations. We're not talking about bulk water today. We can talk about bulk water another time, but we're not talking about it today. Air transported water. I love this graphic. This is from a building science group presentation. Basically, there's a 1-inch hole in a wall can move in a season as much as 30 quarts of water through a wall if air is transporting it. And if it's diffusing, it will only be 1/3 of a quart. That's why we want people to air seal their houses. Air seal your house, you're going to reduce the amount of air transported water through infiltration. Now, infiltration is that 3 air changes per hour at 50 pascals that you have to hit. The more air transportation you get, the higher your air leakage, the more air transportation you get. But what we're going to be talking about today is water vapor. And water vapor is a tricky one because you don't see it. Water vapor is water on a molecular level. So we've got molecules of water flying through the air in here, and we usually talk about this as relative humidity. The amount of water in the air based on the scale from 0 to 100. 0 being no moisture in the air, 100 being so much moisture in there that's depositing itself as water. That is our rain or condensation. How does vapor move? So everybody knows, good morning, everybody knows that heat rises, right? No, heat doesn't rise, I'm kidding. Heat goes from hot to cold. Warm air rises. Warm air rises because it's got more distance between the molecules. The same thing happens with vapor. One of the rules of science is that nature likes balance. It always tries to go from a point of imbalance to a point of balance. That's why heat moves to cold. Your hot house is trying to heat up the cold Vermont winter. The same thing happens with moisture. Vapor wants to go from a point of high concentration to a point of low concentration to bring them into equilibrium. What is vapor drive? So we're going to be talking about Vermont. There are different vapor drives in different climates. But vapor drive is the attempt of the water vapor to equalize that vapor pressure, the high concentration in one place and low concentration in another place. And in the summer, we have a very moist outside compared to the inside, right? the relative humidity outside is very high compared to the inside. So the vapor drive during the summer is from the outside of your building towards the inside. That's why when you have these whole house ventilators that try to cool your house off, you often get lots of moisture in your sofas and your walls and your pillows, and you can actually feel how damp things are if you're doing that. That flips in the winter. In the winter, you have a very dry outside and a moist inside. You have vapor drive from the inside of the building to the outside of the building. And although we're concerned a little with the summer vapor drive, we're usually recovering from a wetting of an assembly from the winter. In the winter, you have a vapor drive that's from the inside to the outside. It goes through your vapor open wall assembly, usually gypsum or some kind of gypsum board. It goes into your wall through your fiberglass, and it deposits itself on what's called the first condensing layer. The first condensing layer is the first layer. Okay, come on in. Grab a seat. The first condensing layer is just like a cold soda in the summertime. There's plenty of moisture in the air, but it has to hit a solid substance, a solid surface that is below the dew point. In your wall assembly during the winter, we have water vapor, which moves through our assembly and then finds itself at our OSB, which is most often what the outside layer is. That is below the dew point, and just like a glass of iced tea in the summer, that water deposits there. If that sheathing is below freezing, it's very possible that that water will deposit there as bulk water in the form of ice. And then, depending on how the seasons cycle, that may dry out on the other end, on the summer cycle, when the vapor drive changes direction. It can also turn into water, depending on how warm that is. A 2x6 wall, that inside layer of sheathing may be below the dew point, 40 degrees, but it may be above the freezing point because your house is keeping that sheathing warm. If anybody's ever ripped the siding off of a building that's 2x4 construction with fiberglass in the middle, you'll often find bugs, flies or ladybugs or other types of bugs that have put themselves under your siding in order to stay above freezing in the winter, to survive the winter. And funny enough, a lot of them survive it because our houses are there's so much heat coming out of our houses, we're actually keeping that sheathing warm above the freezing temperature. So what can we do to deal with this? Well, there's no way to stop vapor drive. Vapor drive is a fact. It's a part of physics. There's no way to stop the fact that we've got 40% relative humidity inside. It's 20% or 10% relative humidity outside in the winter, and that vapor wants to go through your assembly. There's no way to stop that. The fact is, water gets into walls, either by air-driven moisture, vapor drive, bulk water through leaks, or a waterproof layer. What we have to do is we've got to design our assembly so that water can get back out of the wall in a safe way. One of the ways that we determine whether a wall is safe or not is we look at what's called the permeability or permeance of the materials that make up your assembly. Right now what I've done is I've taken this wall and I've just looked at the materials that are there, and I've looked at what the permeance is, and I'll go a little further into what permeance is in a second. Basically, low permeance means that it's very hard for water to get through, and a high permeance means that water vapor can get through very easily. Sheetrock has got a very high permeance, around a permeance of 20. That goes up and down depending on the product you have. There are, of course, sheetrock products that have special coatings on them to lower their permeance, especially sheetrock for bathrooms. We're not talking about that here. We're just talking about straight old sheetrock. Fiberglass has got a very, very high permeance. Moisture moves, water vapor moves through that really quickly. OSB has got a low permeance. It's somewhere between 0.1 and 1 perms. That means that it is a vapor barrier of some kind. It's not a 100% vapor barrier. It's called a vapor retardant, and we'll look at the class of that in a second. And then on the outside, we've got some Tyvek or some other house wrap, which is very vapor open. And let's just be very clear. Vapor open does not have anything to do with airtightness. You can have a very airtight sheet around your building, taped in all the right places, and a very good jacket for your house, air-wise, and still be vapor open. And that's actually what we're trying to do. We're trying to create very tight houses, so because air infiltration is a huge loss of heat, it's also a way that we have air transported liquid, like I was just talking about. And on the outside, what I've got here, even though they don't show it, is I put siding with a rain screen. And the rain screen is basically just 1x4, 1x3 strapping on the outside of your Tyvek. It puts a space between your Tyvek and your siding, and it gives that siding breathing, a ventilation of that somewhere between 20 and 100 per hour, even with low winds, and that increases the longevity of your siding, whether that siding is vinyl siding or cementatious siding or wood siding. You're basically increasing the lifespan of your siding by putting a rain screen on. So almost every project I've ever worked on is at a rain screen. If you're not incorporating rain screens, you want to know how to, get in touch with me or someone else who's in building science. We'll teach you how to do that. So what is permeance? What's the breakdown of permeance? We have 3 classes of vapor retarders. Now, this is not a vapor barrier. Vapor barrier is plastic. Plastic has a permeance of 0.0001 or something, very, very low. Basically stops all moisture from getting through it. That polyethylene sheet that we used to put on the inside of walls, that is plastic. These are actually retarders. Retarders mean slowing down, right? So we have class 1 vapor retarder, 0.1 perm or less. Class 2 is 1 perm or less, but greater than 0.1 perms. And class 3 is 10 perms to 1 perm. Anything above 10 perms is considered to be vapor open. So in that list that we just had, when we're looking at OSB, depending on the manufacturer, but in general, OSB is pre-digested wood particles left over from other processes that are pressed together with glue. That's basically what it is. And if you leave that in contact with moisture for a very long time, we all know what happens, right? It turns into mush. Well, that mush is that pre-digested wood that's in there, and the glue has just been dissolved by the water. But it's very, very low permeance. And by the way, although they won't tell you that, in general, zip walls are OSB. If you look at the tech sheet, the spec sheet on a zip, it says it's got a permeance of 13. Well, that's only that green coating on the very front of it. The rest of it is OSB. So treat zip as OSB in this type of analysis. And we have classes of vapor control. These are all from Building Science Group 106, which is Understanding Vapor Barriers by Yost. The source for that is in the resources in the back. So we have a bunch of terms. 0.1 perms or less is vapor impermeable. When we get to that OSB, we're at semi-impermeable, 1 perm to 0.1 perms. Vapor semi-permeable, 10 perms to 1 perm, and vapor permeable is above 10. Okay, so that's just a primer, and I know it's going by quickly, but don't worry because we'll return to this question. But I wanted to point out that vapor works differently in different parts of your building. You've got a different vapor profile on your below-grade concrete wall than you do on your above-grade frame walls, as you do in your cathedral ceilings. Your cathedral ceilings act differently than your walls do, even if they're made exactly the same, because they're not just experiencing vapor drive, they're also experiencing the stack effect. If your top air barrier is not completely well sealed, if you're making a house that's 3 air changes per hour, which is the code requirement, then there are places where the stack effect, that warm, moist air, which is more buoyant than the rest of the air, pushes up through that, gets into your attic space, into your cathedral ceiling, and then once again hits that first condensing layer and condenses as water or ice, depending on the temperature, as I said. And then I said, why does it matter whether it does matter where in the building we are. One of the reasons is because the temperature ranges and the moisture sources are different for all of these assemblies. Climate matters too. If you're in southwest America, we have a mixed dry or a hot dry, or you're down in Georgia, mixed humid. You're going to have completely different temperatures. You're going to have completely different vapor drive profiles. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Vermont. So as for right now, we're right there. Bonk. Actually, I think I got Plattsburgh by accident, but just there in the area. So if you're working in a different environment, you got to know that what I'm telling you doesn't hold for that. If you're going to be moving to Georgia or helping design for Georgia, you're going to need to look at. Hi. Sorry, Mike. It's okay. Grab a seat. If you're going to be building in a different environment, you need to know that you have to talk to a building science consultant or expert to find out what the proper profile is for where you're at. Basically, if you're in a cooling-dominated climate, you put your vapor barrier on the outside because the vapor drive is almost always from the outside to the inside. You're talking Miami, it's always more moist outside than it is inside. You're trying to protect the building from outside air. You're cooling your inside, you have a lower relative humidity, etc. When you got your air conditioner going, if you don't tilt the air conditioner out the window right, all that water comes back in. Well, that's the condensed water that's pulling out of the air in your house. Okay, Joe Seabrook, one of the building science gurus. Also, a lot of fun to watch. If you want to watch some really funny building science, Joe Seabrook is great. He's really tongue-in-cheek. He's a funny guy to watch. This is the quote from BSD 12, Moisture Control for New Residential Buildings, which is in the reference, and I recommend you read it. Moisture accumulates when the rate of moisture entry into an assembly exceeds the amount of moisture that the assembly can release. That kind of makes sense. I mean, if you have an assembly, the assembly gets wet and then it dries out, you're never going to have a problem. It wets, it dries out. When it wets and dries out halfway, and then wets again and dries out halfway, and wets again and dries out halfway, you get to that 70% humidity in that wood that you can get your wood, your mold, your mildew, your wood rot, and things like that. Okay, the test of Peter Yost, another building scientist that you may not have known, but hopefully after this you will start looking for Joe Seabrook, John Straub, and Peter Yost when you're doing research, or call me and I'll put you in touch with their information. He has a test for a safe wall. You have an assembly, you want to see if it's going to be safe. What do I look for? So first he says, 1, determine the vapor permeability of each component. I did that, right? I made a list of the components and I put the permeability down, and then we can look at, is it reasonable to think that moisture, once it gets in there, is going to be able to get out? 2, identify the least vapor permeable components. Okay, well, I did that too. OSB in that assembly was the least vapor open. Assess the extent and direction of vapor drive. Well, that has to do with the climate, right? How bad is the vapor drive going to be? Now, something you have to keep in mind is we're talking about occupants who maintain a normal relative humidity in their house, between 30 and 50% relative humidity during the winter. If you have someone who's like plant person and they've got 15 planters and they're putting 7 gallons of water into their plants every day, you're going to have a higher relative humidity. You're going to have a much more dangerous situation. Just as if you were going to design a room that was going to be a hot tub or an inside pool. You have a completely different moisture profile than what I'm talking about here. You need a much different situation. 4th, you need to assess the moisture storage capacity and drying potential of the assembly. Now, we're much more going to be putting the moisture storage capacity on side because that's really kind of hard to gauge. Yes, cellulose has a moisture buffering capacity. Yes, fiberglass has a moisture buffering capacity. But what we're really interested in is that drying potential. We want to design a wall that when it gets wet, and it will get wet because all walls, even the best flashed wall, is going to get some moisture in it at some point. We want to make sure it has the opportunity to dry out. Okay, so I want to start with old walls. People will say, yeah, well, I built houses like my grandfather built them, like my dad built them, and I'm building the same way, and they're fine. Why were those walls not failing? And my first answer to that is, the question is, why didn't the old walls have moisture? So the first answer is, they may have and you didn't notice. It's possible that you could go to one of these houses that was built 20, 30 years ago, and the 80s and 90s were notorious for this type of building failure, and find that they were failing. It's possible and more likely that they were just so leaky that the wind was transporting the moisture out of there for you. But we're not doing that anymore. We're not building houses with 10 air changes per hour because we understand that that's a huge loss of energy, and it can lead to other problems like that transport of moisture into our assemblies. And the other is that most of these old buildings were built with materials that were much more able to withstand the types of damage we're talking about. Old growth wood. When you buy a 2x4 now, it's not the 2x4 that your grandfather bought in 1974. It just is a different thing. We've gone through all of that old growth wood. It's all very quickly grown wood. It's very soft. You can even feel it. If you've ever demoed in an old house and you pick up a 2x4, you say, dang, I didn't know a 2x4 weighed this. Yeah. And then you pick up a new 2x4, like, woohoo, you know, it's amazing the difference in the quality of the material. They also didn't have OSB. They were dealing with plywood. And plywood's got a much different vapor profile. Okay, so here's our classic wall, right? This is the wall that they told us to build in the 80s and the 90s, and they've made small changes of it, including adding some layers of insulation to the outside. This is a 2x6 wall with some kind of insulation in the middle, a fluffy insulation. I'm putting fiberglass in there. So we got OSB, 2x6, and then we put a sheet of poly inside because we want to keep moisture from getting into the wall. And then we have our sheetrock, and sometimes we put an inch or 2 inches of some kind of rigid insulation on the outside. So this assembly has got a very high risk of failure, and this is the type of assembly we see failing if it fails in the field. And the tighter the building is, as we're getting tighter, that assembly becomes more and more dangerous. So here's the vapor profile. I just built this up. We have our sheetrock inside, poly sheet, fiberglass stud, OSB, and siding with the rain screen. I'm always putting the rain screen in there, even though I know that most builders don't put rain screens in yet. It's just something that I do. So let's look at the vapor permeability of these materials. We've got a perm of 20 for the sheetrock, then we have our poly sheet. That's a vapor barrier, and I put 0.01, it should probably be 0.001 or 0.0001. Then we have a fiberglass stud. Well, that's completely vapor open, but it's sandwiched between that and the OSB, which is vapor closed. This is a recipe for disaster because of vapor drive. Even if you did your flashing perfectly, even if there's no way that bulk water is going to get into that wall, even if your air sealing on the interior and the exterior of the poly sheeting is taped perfectly around every wall socket, around every fixture, you're still going to get some kind of moisture in there, and when it gets in there, there's no way for it to get out. How do we fix that? Well, first of all, never, ever, ever put poly on the inside of a 2x6 anywhere in your construction. I was at a building site. A friend of mine was having his house built, and I walked in just as the guy was putting up the poly sheeting on the inside of the fiberglass, and I said, "Stop! Don't do it. I'm telling you what to do, but don't trust me. Let's call Efficiency Vermont," because it was an Energy Star rated building. Efficiency Vermont does all of the testing on Energy Star buildings and better. So if you're doing a building and you move to Energy Star, which doesn't cost that much more, you'll get all kinds of advice and help from Efficiency Vermont. And the expert at Efficiency Vermont said, absolutely, we are not recommending putting poly ever again in any building. Don't do it. He went back the next day and looked just before he started pulling poly sheeting off, and there was already a sheet of water on the inside of that poly because of construction moisture, right? Everything has got moisture in it. When you put it in, the studs have moisture, the fiberglass has moisture. He was so glad that he ripped that off and just went with a regular sheetrock. And as long as you don't paint your sheetrock with high gloss, it's not 1972, everyone's high gloss. High gloss has got a very low permeance. Or you don't allow them to put vinyl wallpaper up, you'll be fine, because vinyl wallpaper is also vapor closed. Another option is, instead of using OSB, use either CDX or an exterior sheetrock. There are a number of products from National Gypsum and other gypsum companies that have very good rack and other types of structural strength, not as good as OSB or plywood. Plywood starts at a perm of 1, but as it gets wet, because of the way it's built, it actually opens up and it becomes perm of 4. So you get some ability to get more resilience in your construction if you use CDX. And I know CDX is twice the price of OSB, but if you look at the price of it over the entire job, it's usually something like $3,000 or $4,000, which can be a lot. But if you say to your client, look, yeah,
Efficiency Vermont is recommending not to use OSB on the walls. And so they're not recommending zip wall, they're not recommending Advantech, any of that stuff.
Right. And with good reason. Because of this particular wall assembly. If you're not building this wall, I can show you some wall assemblies that you can use OSB on from day to night and it'll never be a problem because we're making sure that it's vapor open to either side of the OSB. If it has drying potential to the inside of the OSB, drying potential to the outside of the OSB, you're fine. However, the CDX, much better. And look, I live in a 1976 raised ranch. When we retrofitted, did a deep energy retrofit in my house, we pulled off the siding and we found out that what was the siding except for in the corners? Homosote.
No.
Right? That has absolutely no rack. That stuff you can grab with your fingers, and just crumble up. And that also was one of the reasons that I had 8.5 air changes per hour in that house at 50 pascals. What you can do if you're worried about rack is you use CDX on your corners, depending on how crazy the geometry of the structure is, and you use this exterior sheetrock on the rest of it. Exterior sheetrock has a perm of 20. Very vapor open. It's as vapor open as some of your insulations. Also, you can move the first condensing layer. Make sure that that first condensing layer is not, that the temperature of the inside of your OSB or CDX or whatever is higher than the dew point. And you do that by moving the profile of the temperature of the R values into the wall. So the brand new RVs came out, and RV said, in Vermont, you should put 2 inches of rigid on the outside. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not good enough. I'll show you in a minute why. So this is a ceiling. I'm not worried about well-vented attics. Well-vented attics are, by definition, well-vented. If you put your prop vents in right and you make sure that your insulation, that your soffit vents are communicating to your prop vent is going to a well-vented, either gable-vented or ridge-vented roof, you're going to be fine. I'm not going to climb up there in 5 years and see mold all over the inside of the sheeting. And even if I did, that can be fixed. You can get rid of the mold either by blasting with ice pellets or use the aerosol, or you can add more ventilation. This was created, and I'll just read off what we have here. And this is once again from that post by Peter Yost on the Green Building Advisor, Vapor Profiles. On the inside we have sheetrock, then we have foil-faced polyiso. Then we have fiberglass, then we have grace ice and water shield, and then we have sheathing with shingles right on top of it. You can even see it. There's the polyiso with the metal, right, that aluminum coating. Then you've got this 2x12 with fiberglass inside it. Then you've got your OSB, your grace ice and water shield, and right on top of that is shingles. Well, all of that except for the sheetrock is vapor closed. Also we have the fiberglass in between, that sandwich, which is hydrophilic. You know what hydrophilic means. Philic is love, hydro is water. Fiberglass loves water. It loves to drink water. It's a place where mice love to make their homes. And once water is in fiberglass, it doesn't really like to let go of it. So if we're going to have fiberglass in our assemblies, and I understand fiberglass is nice and inexpensive, it's also hard to install properly, but that's a whole other story. How do we make this assembly good? How do we make an assembly? We have to make cathedral roofs. Our clients want cathedral roofs. They want to use that space instead of having it just be a vented attic. Okay, well, we can do that. And we can do that and still hit the numbers that we have to hit for minimum R values, right? A minimum R value of a roof is R49 here, which is really anemic as far as I'm concerned, but that's fine. So here's an assembly that I'm working on, a passive house up in southern Quebec. But this is an assembly that we have developed over the years. It's a very, very robust assembly. What we have is we've got a sheetrock, and then on the inside we have OSB, and that OSB is an air seal. And yes, it is OSB. However, then we have our truss with cellulose. Then we have a membrane. This happens to be the My Vest from a Sega product, but there are a number of other of them available. Then we have a 2.5-inch vented gap. Then we have our sheathing, and then we have our shingles. So we have a rain screen in our roof. What does that do for us? Well, it allows for air to pass over the top of the My Vest, which is perm 38, so it's very, very open. Any moisture that gets trapped in this assembly is going to dry out as the air transports it through this vent gap. And the vent gap is allowed to be as little as 1.5 inches, but the more you give it, the more air changes it gets, and the better it is at venting. At the top, we've got a ridge vent, and there's even a new ridge vent assembly, which has got a bigger ridge vent that you can use if you want to. And then my shingles are on top of that. After you have sheathing and ice and water sheet, whatever you want, then your shingles. And that does two things. It allows this assembly to dry out, and it increases the longevity of our shingles.
What's your sheathing on that?
Right, I usually use CDX personally, but there are people who will use OSB up there or some other type of vent.
But you don't recommend it?
I don't recommend it. I like the durability of CDX, even though it's more expensive overall. So one of the things that makes shingles age is accelerated winter-summer profiles. If we're back on this roof lives the same heating and cooling cycles that our building lives. It's not detached from it. It's attached to it. So if I have to heat my building up because it's losing heat, then that heat is actually getting to my shingles. And then it freezes at night, and then it warms during the day, and it cools at night. So you're getting these micro summer and winters. And if you have a 35, 50-year guarantee on your roof, well, instead of your roof going through a normal number of winter and your heating and cooling seasons, you're compressing that by 10 or 20 in a winter because of the shingles being in contact with the rest of the heating and cooling cycles of the building. You're shortening the life of your shingles. We see this all the time in the field. So the reason that OSB is okay here is because I have drying potential to the inside and I've got drying potential to the outside. There's no sandwich. I have, my ham is on the outside and my cheese is on the inside and the bread's in the middle here. It's not going to be very easy to eat, but it will be very safe. Basement walls. So here's a picture of a client's house we went to. We see this all the time also. In the basement, builder puts up 2x6s or 2x4s up against the concrete wall after damp proofing the outside, throws fiberglass up against that wall, and then poly sheeting. Let's look at that again. So we have on the inside our plastic sheeting, then we have fiberglass, which is very vapor open, and wood. And then we have a concrete. Well, I don't have a vapor permeance on the concrete because it's my moisture source. Even damp proofing does not stop moisture from going through a wall. So if you have even a relatively damp outside, you're going to get wet fiberglass back here, and after a while that's going to become moldy. Fiberglass absorbs water from the concrete, even with damp proofing. Oh, and worse, if your concrete wall was poured with forms because you have metal ties through them. And those metal ties rust over time, and they become holes in your wall, and then you have an increase of water flow through your ties. And so you have more water coming through. We see this all the time. If we're going to do work on a basement wall and it's got metal ties, we require that the metal ties get ground down below the surface, and we put that epoxy material on top to stop any moisture intrusion. Okay, the solution for basement walls. Building science to the rescue. We have to make sure that we have really well-defined footer drains, that we have really good loose fill, well-drained fill going down to that footer drain. And that footer drain's got to be, there are people who are saying we should put the footer drain a little below the footer at this point, just to get water that's below the insulation and slab out as well. There's a great study John Stroud put out called Building America Special Research Project High R Foundations, a case study. He's got 15 different basement assemblies that he looks at, including the assemblies that you guys may have been doing in the field or designing for the field. And then he runs them through simulations and he says, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. So the best assemblies, if you're going to put your insulation inboard, are using rigid against the wall, and we prefer EPS personally, but in this study he used a mixture of XPS and polyiso. Problem with both XPS and polyiso is that they have very high embodied energy. It takes more energy to make them than it does to make EPS, and depending on the XPS you get, it has very high global warming potential. The blowing agents off gas and have very high global warming potential. So given an opportunity, a choice, I would much rather use an EPS in that situation than I would use a polyiso or a XPS. That being said, if you have enough of that rigid on the wall, you can then go over to a fluffy insulation because you've already gotten the condensation point inside of that concrete. The concrete is going to be your condensation point. So here's one of the walls that I just described, XPS with polyiso, 2 inches of each. Really, for a standard code house, this is a really well insulated basement. Code says you need R15. This is really more like an R30. It's a really good assembly. You just have to make sure that this little spot here where you have the same assembly and it's above ground, that you're not going to get dew point temperatures on the inside there. Because the ground condition and your air conditions are very different. You're never going to hit anything well below the dew point if you're 4 feet down, but you are going to hit that on the inside of this insulation package. You may hit that if you're at minus 26 with an R30 on the inside of that. So you may need higher R values there. But that can all be looked at. You can take a look. What's my minimum temperature? There's a free program called Therm where you can run the danger scenarios for that. Okay. I said something before. Now we did roofs, we did walls, we did basements. Inside of the exterior sheathing, I said one way to solve the problem of that first condensing layer, and it still allows you to use OSB, is to move that first condensing layer into the wall by changing the R value profile of that wall. If this sheathing is no longer at the dew point, the vapor is going to stay in the wall, but it's going to stay in the wall as vapor, and when the vapor drive changes in the summer, it's going to come right back out as long as you have poly sheathing on the inside, and you're going to have a perfectly safe wall over the extended life of the building. So the way we do this is by increasing the R value of the insulation on the outside of the OSB. There's a paper that was written by Yost where he says the way that you figure out how much insulation you need outboard is you take the minimum temperatures or the average temperatures for every month in your cycle, and then you find out with a 35% relative humidity at 70 degrees, which is our indoor condition in the winter, where we are hitting our dew point. So at 35% at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the psychrometric chart, which is this really complicated chart that shows you where dew points are at different temperatures and different relative humidities, where we're hitting that point. And you can see we have April 2012 through April 2014. These are the average temperatures. And from November through March, we're hitting dew point on the inside of that sheathing. How do we change that? Is by adding insulation. And if I add 40% of the insulation value of that wall to the outside, the inside temperature of that sheathing is no longer below the dew point, and we should be safe. Now, Passive House and John Stroud came out with a research later that said, let's be safe and make that 50%. So we call it the 50-50 rule. If you're building a building and you're building a 2x6 wall and you want to make sure that an OSB is safe, you got to put 50% of the R value outside. Well, you got an R. Now, with thermal bridging, an R23 wall is really an R17 wall. That's the reality of it. Thermal bridging through the stud. So if we call it an R20 wall just for the fun of it, and we need to put enough insulation on the outside to make that work, then we're making an R40 wall, which is actually a high-performance wall. Or we can go down to a 2x4. As long as we're hitting the R values for the wall, it doesn't matter if it's 2x4 or 2x6. You got your R12, and you put 3 inches of rigid EPS on the outside, and you've got a very safe wall. You don't have to build a 2x6s. We know structurally that's not necessary. Yeah.
So on the exterior wall, you want your insulation on the exterior or the inside of that?
On the exterior. That's right.
So not like Zip Wall is doing their new, what is it?
Double stud wall. No. Oh, that, yeah, okay. So Zip Wall came out, and what you're talking about, Zip Wall came out with a brand new sheathing product where they have the zip, and then they have either a half, 1 or 1.5 inches of polyiso on the inside. That is not what we want. It's not enough. You could add to that and say, give us our, so.
Aren't you also creating a double vapor barrier with that because your sheathing is on, because your insulation's on the wrong side.
Yeah. So there are two things there, and the first question is, it doesn't matter where the insulation is as long as the first condensing layer is warm enough. So if the first condensing layer is the polyiso and it's warm enough, we know that 1.5 inches is not enough. We know that it's 3 inches of poly that we need for that. So if you're going to do that, well, do a 2x4 with the 3 inches of polyiso, and then that first condensing layer is not an issue. You may, polyiso, especially if it has a foil facing, has got no perm rating. It's, perm of 0.0001. So the chance that there's any moisture getting into that wall is very low. But if it does get in, there's nowhere for it to go to. So if you're going to use the zip, and I'll just talk for a moment. I didn't put a slide in here about it, but the double stud wall, which is very popular, and I've built a number of them, and a lot of them are using the zip system on the outside. What they found is that the modeling says it'll fail. But they also found that when they have these walls and they rip them apart, they're not failing. So as long as the drying potential is at least to the inside, it seems like those walls are okay. So you build a 12-inch double stud wall. The vapor gets in, it condenses against the inside of the surface, but it's been doing that as ice because there's nothing really between that wall and outside to raise the dew point of the inside surface. That then melts, but it melts when the vapor dryer changes direction, and then it's drying out. So there was a series of houses. There was a Journal Light Construction report on this a year and a half ago. They built 3,000 units of double stud walls with 12-inch insulation, and what they found was when they ripped them apart, there was no degradation after 3 years. Well, I said it to my friends, and they're like, okay, let's rip them apart in 5, let's rip them apart in 10. Let's see how durable this is, because the one wall that everybody's building that they're really worried about is the double stud wall. There was a house in Fairfield that we did a deep energy retrofit in. It was a double stud wall from 1989. And when we took the pictures of this wall with the infrared before we did any work on it, you could see it looked like an old equalizer, right? The bays were filled and not filled. It had settled. We did a relative humidity check in the wall. It was above 70% relative humidity. The house was being eaten to bits by carpenter ants, and the guy who was there from the pest control said, well, I can come back and kill more ants, but it's not getting at the root. The woodpeckers were pecking through all of the trim. It was a disaster. So what we ended up having to do is rip all the exterior walls off, pull all the insulation out. It ends up there were 2 layers of sheet plastic on either side. There's nowhere for it to dry. Never mind the fact that at the time the cellulose that was available didn't have borate in it, so the ants loved it for nesting material and things of that sort. A double stud wall is still a great assembly, but build it instead of with zip sheathing, build it with CDX in the corners and with that vapor open exterior sheetrock. Great product. They've been using it in commercial for 20, 30 years. It's got a very good track record. Okay, so when we look at this, what we're seeing is we need to actually increase, if we're going to build these walls and try to move that dew point in, with more exterior insulation. And the problem with polyiso is not just the global warming potential, but polyiso has been shown in tests to have an R value that decreases with decreasing temperature. So it's got an R 6.3 at 74 degrees, which is when they test it in the lab. But what do I need at 74 degrees? I don't need that. I need to know what it is at 5, at -5, at -20. It ends up that polyiso at -20 has got lower R value per inch than EPS. EPS starts at 4 per inch, but as it gets colder, the R value goes up. At 5 degrees, they both have an R5 per inch. Who knew? So if you're going to spec an insulation, EPS is lower global warming potential, lower embodied energy. It's got a higher perm rating, so if moisture gets trapped in it, it can actually release it. And the R value goes up as it gets colder. At some point, we may actually change the test we're doing for these materials and start testing them at the temperatures we want to use them instead of at 74 degrees. Okay, so the safest wall design principles. Ensure good interior and exterior barrier to reduce the air infiltration so we don't have the air transported fluid. Design walls so that the exterior components of the assembly have 5 times the permeance of the inside. Or, if you're not going to do that, if you're going to do a zip wall, make sure that inside air, your inside surface is very vapor open so that the drying potential of the inside is not hampered. So no poly, no high gloss paint, and no vinyl wallpaper. And make sure that stays somewhere in the deed so that people know it after the 3rd sale, because you can ruin it later also. Get the help of someone like me to look at your designs, and if we have to, we can run some simulations on therm or something else to find out where the dew points are and make sure your assembly is safe. The building science approach is a whole buildings approach. We're not just looking at the vapor drive. That's just one of the various things we look at when we're looking at a design. We're looking at trying to create houses that are durable well beyond 100 years. How do I find out what the permeance of a product is? Well, we have these material sheets, and somewhere in the materials, thermal resistance, density, compressed, there it is, vapor permeance. Now, it may give it in Pascal second meter squared, which, not something that many of us understand, or you can just read it. It says in perms. 31 perms, great. It's above 10, it's vapor open, right? That was the thing. So Roxol, great product. It's a recycled product. It's made from the slag from the steel industry. They're not making slag to make Rockwool, although there's also silica involved, which is a raw material. Then we also, I thought I had another one in here for fiberglass, but I seem to have left that sheet out. Here's the resources page. I know it's really small, but the presentation will be available, so you can get that from me, and you'll be able to just click on the resources. Yeah?
What's the option compared to the fiberglass?
They basically are both completely vapor open.
Okay.
The difference, of course, is that the installation of Roxol yields a class 1 installation more often than fiberglass. So I don't know if you guys know about the installation classes. There are 3 classes of installation. It's called the installation. There's 3, 2, and 1. 3 is crappy, 2 is okay, and 1 meets the requirements that give you the R value that it says on the package. So if you are installing fiberglass, so what is it that insulates in fiberglass and Rockwool and any of these? It's air. Trapped air is what does the insulating, right? If you take fiberglass and you go like that, it's going to bounce back a little, but it's not going to bounce back to its original size. So if you're putting it in and you put it in and there are any gaps more than 1/4 of an inch on the sides, if the edges are cupped in, if they're not flat up against the studs, that's a class 3 installation. That's really hard not to do with fiberglass. If you're using Rockwool, you push that in, that comes back just like a sponge. I love the stuff. I mean, I don't like working with it because it's nasty, just like fiberglass is, but it's a really robust material. When you squeeze it, it goes right back to its same thickness. The guy who sells, or the person who sells Rockwool, is going to show you that it floats on water and that it doesn't absorb water. That's not true. Over a certain amount of time, it's fibrous. It's going to absorb some water. But it's just like, it's not, hydrophilic the way fiberglass is. You take fiberglass, put it in some water and put it out, it's dripping wet. You put the Rockwool and you stick it in, you pull it out, it's going to be a little wet, but it's not going to be really wet. So those are the things that we like. There is on the website of the EPA, I believe, and the DOE, classes of installation of insulation. If you look it up, it'll say this is what it should look like. It doesn't look like this. If you have a class 3 installation and you're expecting your fiberglass to give you R 3.3 per inch, you're kidding yourself. You're probably down at a 2.5 or 2.75. They actually have a reduction factor in there if you have a bad installation. One more thing that I didn't say, and I know I wanted to put this in, never, ever, ever use fiberglass to insulate your perimeter joist base. It doesn't do either insulate or air seal. What you want to do in your perimeter joist space, and I'm not a big fan of spray foam, but if you're going not to be doing an exterior airtight barrier like bringing CDX down and taping it to your cement wall, then spray foam is better than fiberglass. Fiberglass does, the air is pulled in, the stack effect works, the air pushes out through the top, and then it has to re-equalize so it sucks air through your perimeter joist. If you go down to any of your houses that is an old house and you have fiberglass in the perimeter joist space, you pull that out, it's going to be black on the inside. And it's not going to be black because of mold, although that may be mold, and check that out. It's most likely going to be black because it's been filtering the air that's been coming through and it's full of dust. So in the middle of the winter, if you pull that fiberglass out, first of all, you're going to see frost on your joist. Second of all, you're going to notice that the fiberglass is not keeping it any warmer down there, and that mice love to turn it into bathrooms. So if the
guys go around the perimeter of the joist, the band joist, and then they put the fiberglass in the middle.
Yep.
So they seal it on the edges and then put a piece of fiberglass in.
Right, which will it'll reduce the airflow into that, but it's not a real good solution. A real good solution is either spray foam or cutting out squares of some kind of rigid insulation and foaming that into place. The best solution is put your air barrier on the outside, make that your CDX, and air seal that all the way around so no air can get in there anyway. A lot of people are using OSB rim joists now, perimeter joists. Those things are they're great because they're inexpensive and they're there, but once again it's OSB, and OSB, if it stays wet for any amount of time, turns to mush. And I have a number of pictures from audits that I've done where there's mold growing on a house that's only 4 or 5 years old in the perimeter joist bay. Okay.
They're not cheap. They're expensive.
No, they're not cheap. Well, see, there you go. I'm a consultant, not a builder. So if you need any help, the HBRANV members who are trained in this, myself, Jim Bradley from Caleb Contracting, we've both done the Passive House training. If you're interested in building science, take the Passive House consulting training or take the Passive House builder training. You will learn things you never knew existed. Jim always tells me I forced him to take the training. He says I ruined him for life. And, that's my presentation. Any questions? I know it's a lot. If you do have questions later on, that's my information. Echo Houses Vermont is my company. You can get in touch with me. I'd be happy to consult, come in and give you guys a quick scan of a project and what I would do. Of course, you take everything and decide if it is financially feasible for you or not. But I've studied this stuff. I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years, and I've made some mistakes that I've learned for, and I've also learned from very, very smart people what the right thing is to do. Thank you very much.
Can you put your contact information again?
Yeah, sure. That is my contact information.
So are you recommending, so when you're building the exterior insulation, and which is, so basically what we're doing now is we're actually taking residential homes and making them commercial projects. So that, that's what we've always done in commercials. We've taken them from, they always push the exterior insulation so your dew point's outside of the wall.
Right.
Are you, because it's such an airtight barrier, isn't that where you would use like a rain screen application? I mean, are you recommending like I know with our product, we would recommend a rain screen behind that, some type of rain screen behind that insulation, just to give that breathability and don't tape the joints.
Okay, so we always make our insulation contiguous with a rain screen on the outside. If you have a breathing channel behind your insulation is not doing anything because you're venting that with outside air and it's cold back there. So you're basically taking that insulation, you're putting it, whether it's an inch or 5 feet outside of the building, it's not going to be insulating that anymore.
I'm talking like we have a drain rat problem.
Right.
Or like Green Guard has raindrop.
Yeah.
So what that does is that allows for a little bit of just a minimal amount to allow for that water vapor to come out and to get out of the structure.
I've run it, and I don't mean to step on anybody's feet, but I've run into raindrop in the field, and it scares the crud out of me. That is not a product I would recommend. And when I see it, I say rip it off, put something else on. It's basically a capillary wick.
Yeah.
Right? If you have a gap there and water gets in the bottom, that's going to capillary wick up into your assembly. You don't have enough room for venting. Really venting. You don't have a stack effect really pulling moisture through that. Mm-hmm. So what we do is say nothing between your insulation and your building. Put your rain screen on the outside, make vapor open, make sure you've got a gap between your outside weather-resistant barrier and your siding, whatever that is, and that'll just continue. And if then you need, don't forget, if you're going to do that, you need a core vent at the bottom, you need it at the top, you need to make sure that no bugs are getting in there, and that because we're using the stack effect there. Sun is hitting the side of that, it's creating warm air, warm it rises, causes that to go up, causes a suction motion on the bottom, you get the convective pathway. We're counting on that to dry it out.
So the hydro gap's no good either.
Wouldn't-
That's what all the architects are expecting now.
Yeah, well,
I'm just telling
I'm-
you.
I agree.
and to be
Yeah.
perfectly honest, what I'm finding in the field is when I talk to people, they'll say, "Oh, 10 years ago, Better Building by Design was saying, don't forget your poly sheathing." We're all somewhere in the spectrum of understanding building science and applying it. And LEED was the hot dog of energy resource, being careful with resources. But in the end, LEED is only 15% about building durability and energy. It's more about you being close to transportation and making sure you use plots of land that have been used before and sourcing all your materials as locally as possible, which is all great stuff. But it's not about the building science. That's why I'm really married to the passive house thing, because we're really into building a really durable house. And we do want you to source your stuff locally. We do want you to use materials that have low embodied energy. We'd rather that you don't cut down virgin forest to build a house and use old. But that stuff is on the side of making a super insulated house that uses almost no energy. Remember, a passive house, if I build a passive house here in Vermont, a 2,000 square foot passive house is going to cost you something like $500 a year to heat, or $400 a year to heat, instead of $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 a year to heat. And right now we're at historic lows on the fuel side. Right now you're still getting natural gas at $1.15 a CCF. You're getting liquid petroleum gas at ridiculously low prices. 3 years ago we were out in the field and some people were paying $5 a gallon for propane. Sure. We'll be back there. Now, it's not going to be tomorrow, but we'll be back there at some point. And yeah, right. We're going to go to coal again after the elections, right? We're all going to be putting our coal in there.
The affordability is a real tough thing here, especially in Vermont.
I know.
And a passive house is, maybe you can tell us what percentage higher to build a passive house.
Well, right now, so we have two things in Vermont, right? We've Peter Schneider, who's a consultant for Efficiency Vermont, was the first passive house consultant in the late 1000s, and he said, passive house is awesome. I can get a house that's 90% less energy usage, more energy efficient. It'll cost 10 to 15% more. Some people have gotten it down to 5% more, depending on what you're doing. But he decided, I'm going to make something prescriptive. I'm going to say, instead of having to hire me, the energy consultant, to model this and go to Passive House Institute US to make sure that everything's going to be the way we need it, I'm going to say, okay, R40 walls, R30 slab, R30 basement walls, R60, R80 roofs, minimum 0.21 windows, triple glazing, high efficiency, this, that, and the other. And he's able to get a 75% reduction with that, with almost no extra cost. Nate Hayward of Hayward Design Build has built 2 houses on Mount Philo. $135 a square foot was his selling cost. So it cost him, with all of his things stacked on top of that, $135 a square foot to build that house. Now, it doesn't have a basement. You build it on slab, and if you added a basement, it may go up to $140 a square foot. But it's not what a lot of builders are charging for a Code or Code Plus house. So you can, depending on how you build it, there are certainly ways of doing it. Adam Cohen, one of the passive house builders from way back, has a panelized wall system with windows included that will bring the price down to $25 a square foot just for the wall. That doesn't include the rest of the house. I'm not saying that you can build a passive house for $25 a square foot, but it brings the incremental costs down. I know that stick built, an average stick-built price house for a passive house in Vermont is between $180 and $190 a square foot.
At least.
Well, you can go up. I mean, but you can go up with anything.
The system we're using also.
Well, we're using ductless air-to-air heat pumps with one outside unit, multiple inside units.
Right.
A lot of the savings that we've seen in passive houses in other climates has been on the heating side. the heating plant side. We don't need a $30,000 heating plant, but at the same time, we do need a $10,000 heat recovery ventilation system, and we do need, a $7,000 ducted or non-ducted heat pump system. So it's no question that a passive house costs more, but Efficiency Vermont has done analysis and shown that the average out-of-pocket cost for a homeowner, because of the decreased energy cost, is a wash as soon as you get the higher mortgage to pay the difference. So higher energy bill, lower mortgage, lower energy, like drastically lower energy bill, higher mortgage, out-of-pocket is about a wash. And we've been able to show that again and again. And a house that's built with, high-end building science-backed durability stuff. Not that you guys can't build a code house with the same types of building science-backed durability stuff. That's why I'm here. I want everyone to build. I don't care if you build a passive house. I wish everyone would, but I know that everybody isn't going to. If you're going to build a code house, build it so it's going to be durable for 100 years. That's what I say. Also, if you build a house and that house is going to be retrofitted in the future, it costs twice as much to retrofit energy efficiency than it does to do it at the time of building. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Very good. Very good.
Can I just have a minute here to your time?
Here's the tie back.